and handmade ladders to rappel down the sheer cliffs. While Glauber slept, dreams of a consulship dancing in his head, the slaves approached from behind, surprised the militia, and killed them all. Upon receiving the news, the Roman Senate was nonplussed. The slaves were making a big old mess of everyone's favorite vacation spot, and it was frankly getting annoying. They weren't quite ready to commit the full force of the legions, so another militia of about 4,000 was sent down, but for some reason, the commander decided to split this force into two before engaging the outlaw slaves. Both halves were too weak on their own, and the slaves defeated the new militia with ease. So, not only had the slaves now won 3 successive battles against the Romans, but they also had the armor, weapons, and equipment that had been sent down along with the 7,000 militiamen. Suddenly, they were a true force to be reckoned with, and slaves from across the countryside, men, women, and children, flocked to the growing, now formidable slave army. The 70 who had initially broken out of the gladiator school found themselves backed up by 70,000 of their closest friends. As the winter of 73 BC approached, Rome had a very big problem on its hands, and it wasn't going anywhere anytime soon. The slaves spent the winter continuing to raid the countryside with impunity and, most importantly, train. Their survival now depended on their ability to stand against the Roman legions on the open battlefield. The core group of mostly Gallic gladiators would individually train groups of new recruits to block, parry, thrust, march, and most importantly, follow orders. Those newly trained individuals would then go off and train their own groups, who would, in turn, train yet more groups. Using this exponential system of training, by the time the campaign season of 72 finally came around, the slaves were ready. And it was a good thing, too, because Rome wasn't going to be sending militias this time. No, this time it would be full consular armies. By most accounts, Spartacus's main aim was to make his way north and get out of Italy. His fellow commander Crixus, however, seemed much more enamored with a life spent pillaging the Roman countryside. So while Spartacus led the bulk of the newly minted army north, Crixus peeled off with about 30,000, the plan being for them to stay in southern Italy and suck up whatever wasn't nailed down. His reasoning, I suppose, was that Rome hadn't been able to stop them so far, and now they were stronger and better equipped. So Crixus was going to get his before he retired. But regular legions are not drafted militias, and untested praetors are not seasoned consuls. And Rome had decided the slave revolt was the business at hand for 72 BC, and sent both consuls for the year, Lucius Gellius Publicola and Gnaeus Cornelius Lentulus, at the head of full consular armies to put down what they now finally recognized to be a full-blown revolt. Crixus and his force did not last very long. Gellius caught up with him, and the far more disciplined Romans were able to carve their way through the mostly Germanic infantry with ease. At least 2/3 of Crixus's army was killed in the battle, including Crixus himself. Spartacus, meanwhile, continued to march north towards the Alps. And there are 2 divergent accounts of what happened next. According to the historian Appian, writing in about 160 AD, Lentulus placed his army between Spartacus and the Alps, while Gellius, fresh off his victory over Crixus, followed Spartacus north. The consuls hoped to trap the slaves between their 2 armies and crush them. But Spartacus acted quickly and decided to attack Lentulus before Gellius was able to arrive and close the trap. The slave army defeated Lentulus's outnumbered legion, whereupon Spartacus wheeled around when Gellius arrived and beat his army too. Then, just to top things off, the 2 defeated consular armies regrouped and combined, whereupon Spartacus defeated them again. I call this version Spartacus Totally Rules, starring Spartacus. The Greek historian Plutarch, on the other hand, writing around 100 AD, says simply that Spartacus faced Lentulus and defeated him before meeting and beating another small Roman legion at the foot of the Alps. No mention is made of facing Gellius or the subsequent third battle. My suspicion is that the latter version, which I call probably closer to the truth, was probably closer to the truth. But whatever exactly happened in 72, the sources pretty much agree on what happened next. Crassus entered the picture and brought the Third Servile War to a brutal conclusion. The big gaping hole in this story, though, is having most likely defeated Lentulus, and with nothing standing between him and freedom, why did Spartacus decide to turn around and head back into Italy? And this gets into the real lack of an answer for what the motivations behind the revolt really were. Chryskis' motives seemed clear. He wanted to kill Romans and take their stuff. Spartacus obviously had some divergent motivation, or he would have kept the army whole, but if he did, why fight all the way to the Alps just to turn around? We will probably never know why Spartacus turned around, but in any event he did, and the army marched back south. With the failure of the consuls the previous year to get the job done, though Gellius pretty clearly seemed to have done his part, Crassus saw his chance to win some of that glory that had so eluded him by putting down the revolt himself. He convinced the Senate to give him the title of praetor and command of 50,000 troops, more than enough, he said, to defeat the rabble once and for all. Crassus, by all accounts, was a strict disciplinarian, even going so far as to bring back the old tradition of decimation, by which every 10th soldier of a retreating legion is executed. He definitely came from the old school of thought that the soldiers ought to fear their officers more than the enemy. It didn't endear him to anyone, and Crassus never enjoyed the kind of love and adulation that Caesar or Pompey basked in, but at least this time, it got the job done. Spartacus led his slave army south, all the way to the very toe of Italy, and began to negotiate for passage across the Straits of Messina to Sicily. Obviously, Sicily had given birth to the first two servile wars, so it seems that Spartacus may have intended to lead a general revolt on the island, acquire new recruits, and, let's say, overthrow the Roman Empire. His wider strategic what he did, not why he did it. Being the leader of an outlaw army, he was forced to deal with Sicilian pirates as his only option for ferrying the army off the mainland. But having paid the pirates did what pirates normally do. They took the money and ran. This left Spartacus lighter in the pocketbook, but, more importantly, up the proverbial creek without a paddle. The toe of Italy is not particularly wide, so as Spartacus was trying to flee Italy by sea, Crassus marched his army down to prevent the slaves from backtracking by land. When the pirates betrayed him, Spartacus was trapped. There is some indication that Spartacus attempted to bargain with Crassus at this point, but Crassus would have none of it. He wasn't simply interested in bringing the revolt to an end, he was interested in defeating the slave army militarily. Crassus had more important things to worry about than the ultimate safety of the Roman people. He had his political career to look out for, and he was banking on a great military victory to catapult him into the upper echelon of the nobility. Negotiate? The consulship was just a day's battle away. Spartacus and his army were in desperate straits. Hemmed in by Crassus's legions, word also began to filter through the lines that Roman reinforcements were arriving from the east, and that Pompey had crossed back into Italy and was heading south to aid Crassus. Spartacus decided that they had to break through Crassus's line now, or they would have no hope at all. He concentrated all his strength on one point, and eventually his army was able to break through the line, running at full steam to escape the toe of Italy before the reinforcements could arrive. But the escape effort, combined with the nearly 2 years of continuous struggle and hardship, had finally taken their toll on the unprofessional slave army. 15,000 men were separated from the main force led by Spartacus, and were destroyed by Crassus and his pursuing legions. Discipline broke down in the slave army, as groups began to flee or fight depending on their own disposition. Realizing that he would not be able to keep his army together for much longer, Spartacus decided to make a last stand. His army turned and threw everything it had at Crassus, but it simply wasn't enough. The majority of the slave army, along with Spartacus himself, were killed in the final battle. Crassus had put down the revolt and stood as the conquering hero of the Third Servile War, and he wouldn't have to share his glory with anybody. Except that about 5,000 slaves had managed to evade capture and continue running north. Pompey was on his way south, with instructions to aid Crassus against the great and terrible slave menace. Not making it in time for the main battle, he instead ran right into these 5,000 fleeing slaves. Exhausted, ill-equipped, and on their last legs, Pompey barely broke a sweat, defeating this last remnant of Spartacus's already defeated army. But, master of PR that he was, Pompey sent a message to the Senate announcing that he, Pompey Magnus, had officially brought the uprising to an end. While the honors were being handed out after the legions returned to Rome, Pompey stood side by side with Crassus accepting credit for things he very obviously did not deserve credit for. The victory over the slave army was supposed to establish Crassus as the preeminent leader of the Republic, but instead he now shared that distinction with Pompey, much to the former's chagrin and the latter's delight. But the enmity Crassus now bore Pompey was not strong enough to make him miss an obvious political opportunity. Both men stood at the head of large armies camped outside the city walls, and neither was particularly disposed to disband them until an understanding was reached. They each knew that the other would be their biggest rival for power, but also that there were dozens of other nobles who fancied themselves the next Sulla. So first, you have to eliminate the pretenders to the throne before you can deal with the real claimants. So Crassus, Pompey, and the Senate agreed that it was in everyone's best interest for Crassus and Pompey to serve as co-consuls for the next year. From there, it would be easy for them to eliminate the weaker competition before inevitably turning on each other to decide the final fate of Rome. Who knew that some impoverished noble named Julius Caesar would wind up beating them both? The slave revolt led by Spartacus was the last such revolt in Roman history. Crassus would probably tell you that it was the fact that he ordered 6,000 recaptured slaves crucified along the Appian Way as the reason why. You see, though he ordered them crucified, he declined to order that the bodies be removed. The decomposing corpses, then skeletons, served as a stark reminder to slaves everywhere what happens if they forget their place in the world. More likely, though, it was the shifting undercurrents of the Roman economy and Roman politics. The bulk of the Roman wars of territorial expansion, where slaves came from, were now a thing of the past. So not only would there be fewer slaves in the future, but those slaves would inevitably become a more precious commodity. The rampant mistreatment that had characterized the master-slave relationship previously shifted into something more humane. Eventually, in the empire, it would actually become a crime to kill a slave. Imagine that, not being able to destroy your own property. How uncivilized. The declining slave population changed the dynamic. So while slavery was still a terrible thing to endure, it was not so bad that huge armies would spontaneously spring up to threaten the peace. No, for the next few hundred years, it is pretty safe to say that the greatest threat to the peace was not revolting slaves or invading foreign armies, but rather the rampant scheming of ambitious nobles to put themselves in charge of the greatest empire the Western world had ever known. It was a race to see who could kill the 500-year-old republic first, and next week we will cover one of the more infamous plots, deadly in purpose but ultimately hilarious in execution, the conspiracy of Catiline. Hello, and welcome to the History of Rome. Episode 37, Go East, Young Man. At the end of the last episode, we conceived Conspiracy of Catiline. However, it has come to my attention that the History of Rome's research assistant mixed up the pages of my outline, and the Conspiracy of Catiline isn't actually scheduled until next week. There is a picture of my helpful assistant being helpful up on the website. She is so helpful. Anyway, this week, we will be covering the events that led Pompey to really earn that Magnus honorific he had been saddled